One rainy night, a little girl stood at the gate, drenched, silent, not crying, just standing there. In a land where even the rocks are drier than tears, a man brewed 2 cups of coffee each morning, but only drank one, until a child left like discarded cargo knocked at his door in the rain. No words were exchanged, but from that silence a home was slowly rebuilt, beginning with a second chair. Mornings in Gully's Notch didn't begin with voices, only wind, a veil of early breeze, thin as cooled ash, swept across pale rock slopes through snapped old pines and slipped under the wooden porch of Caleb Warren's cabin, a lonely house that stood still on the mountainside, as if forgotten by time since some long ago winter. Caleb rose each day while the sky was still blue-gray. No alarm, no barking dogs, just the rhythm of a body that had lived alone too long. He lit the fire with old wood shavings, poured water into a dented tin kettle, and waited for the faint hiss of boiling to rise. The scent of coffee drifted into the cold air, mingling with the wind curling beneath the eaves, forming a quiet peace no one else knew. He poured 2 cups. One he set to the right of the wooden chair, its handle chipped, the glaze ash-tinted. The other he kept in hand. Always the same, every morning, one for himself, and one for someone who never came. He couldn't recall when the habit had begun, only that the gate was always left open, not for company, not for kin, but because Caleb no longer knew how to stop waiting for someone. Wind slid through the rotting fence, pushing the grass in a single direction. No birds flew over this valley. Even the crows had given up calling. It was so still, so silent, that the soft knock of wind on the window frame could make a man hear the loneliness threading its way through the cracks in the wood. Caleb sipped his coffee. It wasn't hot, but it was strong, like his life. Not meant to taste good, just strong enough to keep you awake, to keep you from letting go. Once in the 6th winter since he began living alone, snow fell deep enough to bury the barn's roof. The gate's hinge snapped in the cold, flapping hard against a dead tree. Still, he brewed 2 cups like always. But that day, the cup on the right grew cold by noon, and for the first time, Caleb poured it out. Since then, he'd never poured it again. Someone once asked why he didn't leave the valley. He didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew. If he left, there'd be no place left in the world where a man was allowed to be lonely without having to explain it. The old horse in the back stall still breathed steady. The dusty window pane reflected the pale sky. Caleb poured another cup. The second one still sat untouched beside the same empty chair. But this morning, the wind was different, not stronger, not colder, just carrying something that felt near. Not hoofbeats, but a new kind of silence. The kind that doesn't make a man shrink, but makes him pause. Caleb sat on the porch step, his hand wrapped around the cup. His thumb tapped the rim, a rhythm no one taught him. His eyes settled on the gate, still open, still wind. But somewhere beyond that still horizon, it felt like another soul was learning how to wait. And the cup on the right, the one that never got touched, for the first time in a long, long while, wasn't cold. There was a winter Caleb never spoke of, not to strangers, not even to himself. It remained tucked away in memory like a wisp of smoke swept off by wind, unseen but searing when touched. Back then Caleb was younger. He didn't live in Gully's Notch yet. He still wore long coats, still rode through snow, still had a woman with black hair who tied a white ribbon around her left wrist. She liked to sit on the rail fence at the far end of the ranch, waiting for him to bring the horses in. She liked her coffee too strong. She liked mornings so cold that 2 breaths mingled like a promise that never needed to be spoken. Then came an argument, not loud, just a tired remark he tossed in weariness. If you want to leave, then leave. And she did, as quietly as she had come, The snow began falling on the third day after she didn't return. Her boot prints vanished. The wind swept away every trace. And Caleb didn't search, didn't call, didn't chase. He just sat in the kitchen staring at a cup of cooling coffee, thinking maybe if he stayed quiet long enough she'd come back. She didn't, and that winter never did either. Afterward, Caleb moved up to Gully's Notch, a place far enough that folks forgot he'd ever existed. There he lived among rock, wind, and memories, shoved deep into the drawer of an old desk. No one asked if he had ever loved. And even if they had, he wouldn't have answered, because the pain of retelling didn't lie in the remembering. It lay in having to explain how he'd let someone go, and hadn't tried to hold her back. Since then, he'd never tried to keep anyone again. Sometimes on nights when the wind slipped through the roof's gaps, he still saw her standing by the old fence, not clearly, just a slight figure, sleeves fluttering, eyes searching for someone to lead a horse home. And every morning he still brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for the habit, one for the mistake, not because he believed she'd ever return, but because he couldn't live with the fact that he was the one who hadn't waited. In that barren land of stone and wind, Caleb Warren lived as though he were still guarding a door to the past that no one wished to enter. And yet he never found the courage to shut it. Until one evening, when a soft knock broke through a spring rain, and outside the gate stood someone else who also didn't know where they were supposed to go. Gully's Notch felt like a place never meant to receive anyone. The slopes were slick with loose rock, the soil red with sand. Winters froze the ground stiff. Summers cracked it open like the skin of a man long rejected by life. The mountains weren't tall enough to be called grand, but dry enough to make most turn their horses around halfway through. No one came here unless they were running from something, and no one stayed unless they had nothing left to go back to. Caleb Warren lived at the end of a rutted trail where water trickled one reluctant drop at a time from a hidden spring. His stone house was a leftover shell from an abandoned mining venture. The roof was pine wood patched with lead-stained tin. The walls were hand-stacked dry stones, 3 layers thick, cool in summer, sharp as knives in winter. The front door hung on a single hinge. It still groaned whenever the wind passed through, like the sigh of a house with no one waiting inside. Behind it stood a horse stall, a makeshift fence, and a leaning post where Caleb had tied the same old rope, a rope he'd never used twice. Weeds pushed up through stone. Young cacti grew between his boots, and no one noticed. He lived as if everything around him had stopped long ago. In a year, no one remembered. Each day, Caleb chopped wood, boiled water, mended broken rails. The horse ate little. The hens laid only sometimes. The firewood burned without scent. Everything was ordinary, a kind of ordinary that made time forget to move. The nearest town lay nearly 5 miles off. There was a road, but no one asked for directions. Folks said old Caleb Warren was still alive, like speaking of some familiar ghost stitched into the edge of memory. But the truth was, he didn't live. He just persisted, like part of the land itself. A shadow fixed to the ground, like a rotted fence post no one had yet bothered to pull. He didn't hope for visitors, but he didn't shut the gate. He didn't speak to anyone, but still left a chair out on the porch and poured a second cup of coffee, even when frost bit the rim. He never told the old stories, but he still kept that embroidered cloth in the 3rd drawer, the one she used to dry her hands after their first supper together. The fabric was stained. The stitching had faded, but he had never thrown it out. Some places were made to be abandoned. And some people, like Caleb, chose to stay, not because they were strong, but because there was nowhere else that could forget them quite so completely. The rain began falling just after midday, Western rain didn't come in sheets or pour in torrents. It came slow, drop by drop, heavy and even, falling from an ash-colored sky like someone with trembling hands was carefully dripping water onto parched earth. Caleb sat by the stove, elbows resting on the table, gazing out the dust-frosted window. Rain clung to the glass, streaking downward. Each line like a scratch across memory. He brewed 2 cups of coffee, as always. The one on the left he took in hand. The one on the right remained untouched, set atop a wooden coaster damp from moisture creeping through the roof. After a while, he pulled a frayed cloth from his pocket, dried his hands, and stepped out to the porch. Rain tapped on the tin roof, on the cracked porcelain cup, on the empty space before him. Not urgent, not ending. Then came a different knock. Not loud, not hurried, just a soft tok-tok, so faint, so real, as if the wind had learned to speak in the language of people. Caleb looked up. At the far gate, the one he always left open, stood a figure. Small, thin, soaked through, a dark speck against the blurred sky. He rose. Rubber boots creaked on the worn porch plank. Rain kept falling, and the girl remained still, neither stepping forward nor turning away, as if she had been there a long time, or had come a very long way just to stand here. Beneath a thin jacket, not near enough to keep the rain off, her hair clung to her face in wet strands. Her face was streaked with water. A canvas bag was pressed tight to her chest, but her back stayed straight. Her eyes didn't waver. Caleb stepped closer, then stopped. No one spoke. The wind slid past the gate, carrying the scent of wet earth and old smoke from the kitchen. He didn't ask. She didn't speak, but between them stretched a silence just wide enough for each to hear the other, not in sound, but in presence. The girl didn't ask to come in, didn't plead. She just stood there, like a single punctuation mark on an empty page, waiting for someone brave enough to read that far. Caleb looked toward the leaning fence, then toward the leaking roof. At last he turned and stepped inside. Moments later he returned, carrying an old wool coat, the kind he used to wear in the winter he most wanted to forget. He hung it on the wooden peg beside the door, never glancing at the girl. Then he returned to the table, poured more hot water into the pot, and quietly sat down. The rain kept falling, and the girl did not leave. Not long after Caleb had stepped away from the porch, hoofbeats rang out. Slow, crooked, heavy, like the rider wasn't sure where he was headed, or didn't care if he ever arrived. Caleb didn't look up. He just poured more water into the coffee pot, his hands stiffening for the briefest moment, as if he already sensed that something had come without being invited. Through the narrow window he saw a man in a crumpled leather coat, mud-specked hat slouched low over dull eyes. His horse was gaunt, saddle stained with sweat. The man stopped right at the gate, glanced down at the girl still standing there, soaked through, unmoving, and gave a snort like he'd just unloaded some worn-out thing he'd long run out of reasons to keep. "Don't talk, don't hear, don't fuss. You feed her, you keep her," he said, a voice made of liquor and bitterness. Then he tossed a filthy canvas bag to the ground, a broken comb spilled halfway out, 2 scraps of stale bread, and a faded handkerchief. The girl didn't reach for it. She just stood there, arms clutching her pack like it was the last thing she still had any right to keep. The man turned his horse. No goodbye, no second look. His figure faded toward the line of old willows. Caleb still didn't step outside, but he saw it all through the crack in the door. The girl didn't move, didn't cry, didn't call out. Rain slapped her cheeks, hair pasted across her forehead. Her eyes stayed wide, not in fear, but like she was waiting for one last test of whether the world would notice she hadn't broken yet. The gate remained open. The coat Caleb had hung still hung there, soaked with rain. The second cup of coffee sat untouched on the table, just a bit cooler now for the time he'd stood without moving. And then Caleb did a small thing. He opened the drawer beneath the kitchen shelf, pulled out a tin ladle, and poured a second bowl of hot soup. Not much, just enough. He placed it on the table, facing the empty chair. Then he stepped out to the porch, took the coat from the peg, and walked toward the gate. He said nothing, made no invitation, just held the coat out toward her, his hand brushing the trembling arm of someone who'd just been left behind, as if no one ever needed her. The girl looked at him, didn't move, didn't nod, but she didn't pull away. And in that wordless silence, Caleb understood. The gate he had kept open all these years had finally been walked through. Caleb didn't speak. The girl didn't ask. But when he turned toward the door, stepping across the wooden porch, she followed, with steps so light they made no sound. The rain kept falling, tapping across the roof like tiny pieces of metal clinking together. The door hung ajar, just enough for the stove's firelight to cast a faint glow, a light that invited but asked nothing. She crossed the threshold like someone who'd been turned away by too many closed doors. Bare feet tracked mud across the rough stone floor. Caleb didn't turn around. He set down the tin ladle, pulled a smaller porcelain bowl from the shelf, and ladled out more soup. No one spoke. There was only the wind curling around the eaves, the soft creak of old wood breathing, and the sound of her wet dress dripping onto the floor, like tears from someone too worn to cry anymore. She didn't sit. She just stood near the table, still hugging her pack tight against her chest. Her eyes met the bowl of soup as if it were the first meal ever made for her, not just leftovers. Caleb pulled a wooden chair and set it gently in her direction. An invitation without words. She didn't sit right away, but finally, as he poured more water into the coffee pot, she placed her pack down, softly, carefully, as if afraid of disturbing the delicate silence suspended between two strangers. She ate slowly, no sound. Her hands trembled slightly. Each spoonful was like drawing breath again after a long journey of not being allowed to exist. Caleb didn't watch her. He simply took a heavy blanket from the corner of the room and spread it over the long bench beside the stove. Then he stepped outside, quietly, as if walking out of his own dream, so no one would feel ashamed for staying in it. But before he could go far, the girl did something small. She didn't call to him, didn't plead. She simply reached over and slid her pack toward the corner of the bench where he had laid the blanket, as if to say, "If you've made a place for me, then I'll stay. But only if you don't ask me to leave." Caleb nodded, not in agreement, but because he understood. In a world built by those who've been left behind, sometimes a roof that asks no questions is enough to sleep beneath. He blew out the oil lamp. In the dark, only the crackle of wood on the fire remained, and the steady breathing of a girl who didn't know what home was, and a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone sleep beneath his roof. That night, no one said a word, but the quiet weight of presence put the first small crack in the wall of loneliness Caleb had spent years building. The next morning brought a soft light. The rain had stopped, but the earth was still damp, and the air held the scent of rotting leaves. Caleb rose early, like every day. He didn't glance toward the bench. He didn't look for proof. He simply lit the fire, boiled the water, then stepped outside, carrying an old pair of boots he'd once kept in case someone ever came by. No one ever had, but today he wiped the mud from the soles, let them dry on the porch, and placed them right by the threshold, and in a spot too clear to mistake. This spot is for you. The girl was still curled beneath the blanket. She didn't stir when he stepped out, but when he returned, her eyes were open, no longer wary, just watching as if to ask, "Will this be another time I'm told to leave?" Caleb didn't send her away. He didn't say, "You can stay," either. He just set the ladle down, poured soup into a bowl like always, and walked out to the stable. That morning sun filtered through thin trees, a pale gold, just enough to reveal yesterday's footprints, small, even prints walking straight from the gate to the porch without ever veering. In the stable, the horses shifted sluggishly. The oldest one had a sprained back leg, still lying quiet in the corner. Caleb mucked the straw, changed the water, checked the front hoof of a skinny mule. Routine. Wordless. When he came back, the door was still ajar. The smell of barley porridge hung in the air. And by the stove, the girl sat with her knees tucked up, wearing the old boots he'd left on the porch, pant legs neatly rolled, eyes fixed on the fire. On the table, the second bowl of soup had been turned over. The spoon lay rinsed beside it. Nothing fancy, nothing extra, but clear as anything. Someone had eaten there like they belonged. Caleb didn't praise her, didn't welcome her. He simply poured coffee into the two old mugs, like every morning. This time, when he placed the second cup down, her hand reached for the handle, without looking at him, without a word. But her fingers, trembling faintly at the warmth, told him more than speech could. For the first time in years, someone had touched the cup he'd always poured for the one who never came. No one said anything about it. No one needed to, because some bonds aren't forged through words, but through a dry pair of boots, a washed spoon, and a nod that never meets your eyes. Starting from the third morning after the rain, Caleb began leaving the kitchen door slightly ajar, not to welcome anyone, not out of forgetfulness, but because he knew someone else was waking half an hour before him, tending the fire, reheating the porridge pot, wiping the table clean with a folded cloth worn soft by time. No one asked, no thanks were given. Everything happened as if it had always been that way. Caleb never called the girl by name. There was no need. Each morning he simply laid a slice of cornbread on a plate and glanced toward the bench across from him. If the bread was gone by the time he returned from the stables, then the day would pass as it should. Ruth, though neither had ever said that name aloud, began doing small things, stacking dry wood near the stove, folding the blanket, shaking out the mat at the door. But what Caleb noticed most was how she cared for the old lame horse. No words, no fuss, no fear. Every afternoon when he returned from the quarry, he'd find her sitting by the watering trough, a bundle of young mint leaves in her hands, rubbing them gently into the horse's swollen leg. Her movements slow, steady, as if she were soothing something buried deep within herself. She used a warm rag to clean the hooves, worked dry mud from the fetlocks, and then let the creature press its brow against her shoulder, unprovoked. No one had taught her that. And Caleb had never seen anyone touch that horse without it flinching. The things she did weren't many, weren't grand, but they found their way into places where silence had once begun to rot. There was wood by the stove, water in the trough, coffee with someone to drink it, and Caleb, with questions in his chest he no longer needed answers to. He still didn't say much, just quietly mended the roof, propped the gate, tasks he'd always done alone, now still done, but not with the same kind of silence. She moved lightly, breathed softly, lived like someone who had once been made to disappear. But here, among the brittle stones and sun-bleached dust, no one asked her to vanish. One morning, Caleb left a handkerchief beside the second coffee cup. It wasn't there when he returned, but in its place was a single feather, soft, gray, and clean, laid gently on the table. No words, no reason. Just one quiet way, two strangers acknowledged they had begun to share a small corner of the same world. There were afternoons in Gully's Notch when even the wind went still. The sky held its breath. The trees didn't stir. Stones stayed where they were. That silence didn't weigh heavy. It felt more like a question left open, waiting for someone quiet enough to touch it. That evening, Caleb returned earlier than usual. The sky hung low, but hadn't yet opened to rain. Light sifted sideways through the clouds, falling soft across the tin roof. He led the horse back, saw the kitchen door still half closed, a sign the girl was still inside. There was no scent of soup, no crackle from the fire. But the room was warm, and 2 mugs sat in the sink, washed clean. Caleb hung his coat on the peg, set the oil lamp near the window, and took a stub of white chalk from the bottom drawer of the cupboard, the kind he used to mark new calves in the spring. He placed the chalk on the windowsill, next to a handkerchief, freshly washed. Said nothing, just gave a small nod and stepped back outside, leaving a silence behind that felt like a door left open without pressure to walk through it. When he returned after supper, a slice of cornbread and a bit of stewed beans, the chalk was gone. Near the sliding wood door, the one that creaked with every change in wind, a word had appeared. Small, slanted, soft as the lines on a palm. Ruth. No surname, no birth date, just a name, drawn with care as if the writer feared tearing the grain of the wood, yet written with a certainty that left no doubt this was no child's idle scribble. Caleb stared at that name for a long time. He didn't speak it, didn't wipe it clean, didn't say it aloud. He simply touched the top of the R with the tip of one finger, then stepped inside like a man who'd just received a letter with no return address, and knew without question it had been meant for him. Ruth never asked if he saw it. She didn't wait for a reaction. She sat quietly on the bench by the stove, stitching an old grain sack into a feed pouch for the horse, her hands steady, her gaze lowered, her shoulders at ease. That night, Caleb stayed up later than usual. Before blowing out the lamp, he took a thin piece of wood, sawed it by hand, smoothed one side flat. With a charred stick from the hearth, he wrote a single word on the underside. Ruth. Then he tucked the board into the drawer where the old handkerchief still lay. No one saw it. No one needed to. It was just that, if one day she left, and didn't leave a thing behind, he would still have something to tell him she'd been here, that her name was Ruth, and that once she'd pressed white chalk into the wood at the heart of a house belonging to a man who had long believed he had no one left worth remembering. That afternoon was heavier than most. The air pressed close. No wind stirred. Clouds hung low, like a warning whispered without sound. Caleb was hammering up the south fence when he heard the hoofbeats. Not rushed, not scattered. It was the kind of gait that belonged to a man who hadn't returned out of longing, but for calculation. He leaned the hammer against the post, brushed his hands off on his pants, and walked back toward the house. By the time he reached the gate, he was already there. The same man on the same worn-out horse, the one who'd left Ruth in the rain like a sack of rotten potatoes thrown by the roadside. But this time he wasn't drunk. His eyes were sharp, hands tight on the reins, dust-stained coat rising and falling with quickened breath. Ruth stood in the doorway. She didn't hide behind anyone. She didn't step forward. Her arms hung loose at her sides, but her left hand clenched tight, as if grasping the final thread that tied her to this place. The man tossed a folded piece of paper toward Caleb, creased, sweat-stained, but still bearing the red seal of the lawyer's office down in town. "Paper says she's sold," he muttered. "I signed it. They're paying well for girls down south. You got no right to keep her." Caleb didn't pick up the paper. He didn't look at Ruth. He simply lifted the gate, slid the latch into place. Slow, measured. A motion he'd done 100 times. But today he locked it from the inside. The man shrugged, snorted. He didn't argue, didn't draw his gun. Just muttered one thin line before turning. "I'll be back if you're still holding what ain't yours." Then he wheeled the horse around. Hooves stirred up dry dust, and silence returned to the valley. But this silence carried the scent of smoke, not yet lit. Caleb bent down, picked up the paper, read it, line by line, with the kind of eyes that had once given up reading anything at all. Then he burned it, right there on the porch, letting the ashes fall into the old tin can he used to cook beans. Ruth didn't ask, but she stood there for a long, long time. That night, as Caleb stoked the fire, he noticed the girl had stacked the woodpile higher than usual, much higher. Wind began slipping in through the west wall. Smoke drifted with it, curling toward the fence, the same place the man had ridden off. And Caleb knew it wouldn't be long now. The past would return, not with law, but with flame. Night fell faster than usual. Thick clouds swallowed the moon like a whisper meant to hide. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp ash and cold earth. Caleb never slept deep, never had, but that night he dozed, hand still resting on the axe handle beside his bed, a habit from the rail line days, when shadows in human shape were worse than beasts. The first sound was soft, like wood creaking beneath a cautious step. Then a high-pitched hiss, as if the wind had been cut off mid-breath, and a flash of red slipped through the crack beneath the door. Caleb shot upright, heart pounding hard against his ribs like hooves on bare stone. Ruth was already standing at the threshold. No scream, no shaking, but her eyes were wide and firelight danced in them like twin embers pulsing in the dark. The barn was burning. Smoke thickened and twisted, curling up the roof like a starving beast. The horses screamed, panicked, wild, a sound like soldiers calling for help in the middle of a war. Caleb bolted for the porch, tipping over the water barrels, his breath ragged, eyes stung raw with smoke. Ruth followed, barefoot in the mud, thin nightgown whipping in the hot wind. Flames tore through the barn. The roof glowed red. The fire growled, hungry to devour the dark. The old mare, the pregnant one the weakest, was trapped in the far stall. A beam had fallen across the exit. Smoke churned and cloaked everything. Caleb roared, grabbing for the splintered wood, smoke searing his lungs, blurring his sight. And in that moment he saw her, the girl from long ago, black hair and white ribbon, standing at the fence, the one he'd let walk away. And his chest seized. Not again. Not Ruth. Ruth didn't retreat. She moved around the other side, small hands lifting a blanket, throwing it over the mare's neck, whispering words no one could hear. The horse didn't rear, didn't thrash. It listened, as if it understood the shape of a promise being made in silence. Together, the man turned to stone by solitude, and the girl, once discarded like a broken thing, led the mare out just as the roof gave way. Sparks exploded like shattered stars. Caleb's breath came in ragged bursts, his chest tight, his eyes nearly blind. But Ruth was still there, holding the scorched blanket, guiding the horse through the ash. They stumbled into the rain-wet yard. Caleb fell to his knees, hands digging into the dirt, his chest heaving like it was being torn open. The mare staggered, but lived. And then he heard it. A small sound, raw, fractured, like a dry branch snapping in a gust of wind. Ruth was crying, not loudly, not like a child, but in broken, halting sobs, torn loose from a throat that had been locked too long. She curled in on herself, face buried in her singed sleeve, and wept, quietly, without asking for comfort, without asking to be seen. But Caleb sat beside her, close, silent, as if he too had just been pulled from the wreckage of something inside himself. In the hiss of wind and smoke still drifting, neither said a word. The fire had spoken for them, and that cry, small, real, splintered, was the first thing Ruth had ever let anyone hear. Morning came late after the night of fire, A cool breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of old smoke, damp ash, and stone dust. What remained of the horse barn were broken beams, scorched earth, and a length of fence charred to black, like a row of teeth knocked loose by a punch. Caleb woke early, but he didn't split wood, didn't walk to the creek like usual. He just sat at the table, holding the familiar porcelain cup, not drinking. Ruth hadn't left her room yet. The door was closed, unlatched. She'd fallen asleep last night on the chair near the stove, curled in on herself as if, even in dreams, the wind might still reach her. Sometime later the door eased open. Ruth stepped out, hair matted, shirt singed, but her eyes were clear. She didn't look at Caleb, just walked to the stove, set a cleaned potato into the pot, and lit the fire. No questions, no spoonful of soup, just a single potato, enough for two. As the fire cracked gently to life, Ruth opened the wooden cupboard. She reached for the coat Caleb had left on the table the day before, the one he'd forgotten to fold. She folded it now, carefully, creasing each edge with deliberate hands, and hung it beside her own. A small act, not loud, but like drying off a rain-drenched chair to say, "We'll sit here again." Caleb watched from the table. His chest tightened, not with emotion exactly, but because something inside him, long silent, was beginning to ask to be named again. He stood, stepped toward her, not too close. His voice cracked, thin before it even touched the air. "Thank you for not running." Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply turned, placed a spoon on the table, and sat down, right beside the faded chalk mark still clinging to the doorframe. "Ruth." The fire burned steady. The potato began to smell sweet. Outside, the light was breaking through the clouds. Caleb poured more water into the kettle, lifted his cup. This time he drank. Not because he was thirsty, but because he wasn't drinking alone. And in that small cabin in the valley once known only to wind, two people sat down for breakfast. No words, no obligation, only the quiet knowledge that the other was still there. Because after all these years, Caleb finally understood. No one should ever be left behind again, especially not someone who once came back, without being called, without being asked, and chose to stay. Autumn slipped into dry Rock Valley without warning. The wind no longer growled. It simply blew just enough to sweep yellow leaves across the porch, like someone clearing a path with an unseen hand. Caleb repaired the roof, not because winter was coming, but because he wanted the place to stop leaking for someone other than himself. The girl, Ruth, still woke early, tending the fire before sunlight touched the mountain peaks. No need to knock on Caleb's door, no need to call. The stove glowed warm. The kitchen was clean. Water simmered gently in the old iron pot. Each morning, Caleb still brewed 2 cups of coffee. But now it wasn't a ritual for the dead or the never returned. 1 cup sat before him, the other across the table in front of the low-backed wooden chair, wiped clean with the cloth Ruth had laundered yesterday. No one had asked her to do it. She just did. They sat beside each other, not face to face, just looking out across the field. The old mare, the one they pulled from fire, moved slowly now, still limped some, but the fear had faded from her eyes. Ruth no longer chalked her name on the walls. She drew soft circles in the dusty tabletop with her fingertip. Once, Caleb left a sheet of paper on the table, blank. Beside it, a short pencil. Nothing more. The next morning, a small flower had bloomed there. A simple sketch, clumsy in shape, but right in the center of the page. Ruth looked at him as he took the first sip of coffee that day. Caleb met her gaze, didn't smile, didn't ask, just gave a quiet nod. Acceptance, unspoken. The cabin hadn't changed much, but the feeling inside it had. It was no longer just a place to pass the days. It had begun to feel like a place to return to, with no promises needed. And that second cup of coffee, for the first time in all those years, was no longer meant for someone who'd gone, but for someone who'd chosen to stay. Evening slowed in the way only the West knows how. Sunlight stretched across the mountainside like a ribbon of dry honey. The sky wasn't harsh, just golden and wide. A flock of crows shifted quietly westward, toward where the smoke trails of day faded into a pale orange sky. On the porch, Ruth sat with her knees drawn in, hands wrapped around a porcelain cup. Not hot, just warm enough to keep her fingers from the cold. She didn't move, didn't write, didn't tend the stove. She simply sat, alone, back resting against the weathered wooden post. Caleb saw her through the window. He didn't call out. Instead, he walked behind the house to where a piece of silvered pine had been waiting. He'd saved it for weeks. Planks pulled from the old fence, now sanded smooth by hand, slowly, carefully, as if each cut of the saw carried a word he'd never been able to say. When the sun touched the ridge, Caleb stepped onto the porch with a low-backed wooden chair in his arms. The second chair. He said nothing, just set it down beside Ruth, far enough not to intrude, close enough to sit if someone chose to. He sat. Their shoulders didn't touch. Their eyes didn't meet. They simply sat. One cup of coffee, warm, in his hand. One more, cooling, beside hers. Neither drank. They just remained there. An evening like 100 before. But this time, no one had to stand. No one had to leave. No words were needed to define what was happening. No questions were asked to bind it to a promise. Only a second chair, set down by the hands of a man who had once buried himself in silence. Only a girl, once left behind, still sitting there as evening came. And though their eyes did not turn to meet, they both faced the mountains, the place that had once been the edge of their loneliness. Now it was just the horizon. You don't need someone to fill the silence, just someone who chooses to stay. Truly, this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning of something that never needed to be named.